The boy hadn't spoken a single word in 4 years. Not to his mother, not to his teachers, not to the therapists who came and went like seasons, each one promising breakthroughs that never materialized. His name was Ethan, and at 8 years old, his world existed entirely behind a wall of silence that no one could penetrate. The doctors had explanations: autism spectrum disorder, selective mutism, sensory processing challenges. But explanations didn't fill the void in his mother's heart every time she watched her son retreat into corners, his eyes fixed on something invisible, his lips sealed as if stitched shut by forces beyond human understanding. She had tried everything: music therapy, art therapy, equine therapy. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. And then the dog arrived. But this isn't a simple story about a pet changing a life. No. What happened in that small house on Maple Street would defy every expectation, challenge every assumption, and leave an entire community questioning whether something extraordinary had walked among them wearing the shape of a scruffy rescue mutt named Charlie. Because when Ethan finally spoke, when those first words tumbled from his lips after years of crushing silence, what he said wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. He repeated something the dog had told him, something the dog couldn't have known, something that would lead authorities to a discovery so remarkable, so heartwarming, that even the most skeptical among them would struggle to explain what had truly happened in the quiet bedroom where a boy and his dog sat in the darkness, communicating in a language that existed somewhere between miracle and mystery. You won't believe what they found. But first, you need to understand how this all began. Sarah Mitchell had given up on miracles the day her husband left. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for the hollow thud of a suitcase hitting the front porch and the sound of a car engine fading into the morning fog. Ethan had been 4 years old then, already showing signs that he experienced the world differently than other children. He didn't like crowds. He didn't like loud noises. He didn't like changes to routine. And when David Mitchell decided that fatherhood was too difficult, that silence was too heavy, that he needed a life without complications, Ethan stopped speaking altogether. Just stopped, as if the words had evaporated from his throat, leaving only emptiness behind. Sarah remembered the exact moment. They were sitting at the breakfast table, and she had asked Ethan if he wanted orange juice or apple juice. A simple question, the kind of question she had asked 1,000 times before. But instead of answering, Ethan had simply stared at her, those wide hazel eyes reflecting something that looked terrifyingly like understanding, and said nothing. He didn't cry. He didn't gesture. He just retreated into himself, building invisible walls that Sarah would spend the next 4 years trying to tear down. The first year was filled with hope. Doctors told her it was a phase. Trauma response. Give him time. Give him space. Give him love. She gave him everything she had. The second year was filled with frustration. Speech therapists came with flashcards and puppets and reward systems. Ethan participated just enough to avoid meltdowns, but not a single word crossed his lips. Not one. The third year was filled with grief. Sarah mourned the voice she was forgetting. She couldn't remember exactly what Ethan sounded like anymore. The recordings on her phone from when he was 3 felt like artifacts from someone else's life. A different mother. A different child. A different universe entirely. The fourth year was filled with acceptance. Or at least, that's what she told herself. She learned to read Ethan's gestures, his expressions, the subtle shifts in his body language that communicated more than words ever could. He wanted macaroni and cheese for dinner. She knew by the way he tapped twice on the pantry door. He was tired. She knew by the way he rubbed his left ear. He was happy. She knew by the way he lined up his toy cars in perfect rows, each one exactly 3 inches apart, a ritual that brought him comfort in ways she couldn't understand but had learned to respect. She had made peace with silence. Or so she thought. It was October when her sister Julie called with an idea that would change everything. Julie worked at a rescue shelter 2 towns over, a cramped facility that smelled of antiseptic and hope and desperation. She specialized in finding homes for the cases no one else wanted: the older dogs, the disabled dogs, the dogs with behavioral issues that made them unadoptable in the eyes of everyone except the rare angel who saw past the surface. "There's this dog," Julie said, her voice carrying that particular mix of excitement and caution that Sarah had learned to recognize. "He's different, Sarah. I know you've said no to this before, but I really think you should meet him. Sarah had said no, multiple times. A dog felt like one more responsibility, one more creature needing something from her, when she was already stretched so thin that some mornings she wondered if she would simply snap in half. But Julie was persistent. Julie had been persistent about everything since they were children. The first to climb the highest tree, the first to dive into the cold lake, the first to believe that the impossible was just another word for not yet. His name is Charlie, Julie continued. He's about 3 years old, some kind of shepherd mix, and he was found wandering on the highway last month. No collar, no chip, no history. But here's the thing, he's different. I can't explain it. He just knows things. The staff here, they say he can sense things before they happen. We had a volunteer last week, seemed perfectly fine, but Charlie wouldn't go near her. Kept pacing, wouldn't settle. Turned out she was having a cardiac event. She collapsed an hour later. If Charlie hadn't alerted us, if we hadn't called the ambulance when we did, she might have died. Sarah wanted to dismiss it as coincidence. Dogs were perceptive, sure. They could smell adrenaline, detect changes in blood sugar, respond to micro-expressions that humans missed. There was science behind it, reasonable explanations. But something in Julie's voice made her pause. Something raw and genuine, and just a little bit amazed. What do you think he'd do with Ethan? Sarah heard herself asking, and she didn't quite know why. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Julie spoke, her words careful and measured, as if she was handling something fragile. I don't know, but I think you should find out. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the parking lot of Maple Valley Animal Rescue, her hands gripping the steering wheel of her parked car, her heart pounding against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. Ethan sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the patterns of raindrops sliding down the window, tracing their paths with his finger in a way that seemed almost meditative. He didn't know why they were here. She hadn't told him. She didn't want to get his hopes up for something that might end in another disappointment, another failure, another crack in the fragile foundation of their life. The shelter looked exactly as she had imagined, a low cinder block building with faded blue trim and a mural of happy dogs and cats that had clearly been painted by school children decades ago. The colors were washed out now, the painted animals seeming more ghostly than joyful, their eyes following Sarah as she unbuckled Ethan from his booster seat and led him toward the entrance. The smell hit her first. That unmistakable cocktail of animals, an industrial cleaner, and something else underneath, something primal and urgent and alive. The sound hit her second, a cacophony of barks and whines and howls that seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing off the concrete walls until the whole building vibrated with canine chorus. Ethan stopped walking. His body went rigid, the way it always did when sensory input became too much. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands finding his, her voice dropping to that low, steady whisper that sometimes helped ground him. It's okay, sweetheart. It's loud, I know. We can leave if you want. We don't have to do this. But Ethan wasn't pulling away. He wasn't covering his ears. He was listening, really listening. His head tilted slightly to the side, and for just a moment, so brief that Sarah might have imagined it, something shifted in his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition, as if somewhere in that chaos of sound, he heard something specific, something meant for him. Julie appeared through a door marked staff only, her face breaking into a smile that didn't quite hide the wonder behind her eyes. You came. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I, Sarah admitted. They made their way through a narrow hallway lined with cages, each one containing a dog who pressed against the wire mesh with varying degrees of enthusiasm or fear. Ethan walked slowly, his gaze moving from one cage to the next, not quite making eye contact with any of the animals, but not avoiding them either. He seemed to be cataloging them in some internal system, noting their colors and sizes and states of agitation with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. And then they reached the last cage at the end of the hall, and everything stopped. The dog inside didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't press against the mesh or paw at the door. He simply sat in the exact center of his small enclosure, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made Sarah's skin prickle. He was medium-sized, covered in matted brown and black fur that desperately needed grooming, with one ear that stood straight up and another that flopped forward at an odd angle. Unremarkable by any standard measure. The kind of dog you might walk past at any shelter without a second glance. But those eyes held something that Sarah couldn't name. Intelligence, certainly. Patience, too. But underneath both was something deeper and older and more knowing than any dog had a right to be. It was as if, behind that amber gaze, someone was watching. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. Ethan stopped in front of the cage. He didn't reach for the mesh. Didn't make any sound. But his entire posture changed, shoulders relaxing, hands unclenching, the perpetual tension draining from his small frame like water through sand. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, and the dog stood in perfect stillness too, and between them something passed that Sarah couldn't see but could absolutely feel. Charlie, Julie said softly. That's his name. Charlie. Ethan's lips moved. Sarah would later swear she saw them move. Not forming a word. Not yet, but the ghost of a word. The shape of something trying to escape. The drive home was silent in a way that felt different from usual. Not empty. Charged. Ethan sat in the back seat with Charlie's face pressed against his thigh. They had completed the adoption paperwork so fast that Sarah's hand was still cramping from signing. And for the first time in 4 years, silence felt like it contained possibility instead of absence. That night, Ethan refused to sleep in his own bed. He insisted, through a series of gestures so emphatic that they bordered on frantic, that Charlie needed to stay with him. Sarah helped arrange a dog bed on the floor beside Ethan's mattress. But when she returned 30 minutes later to check on them, she found both boy and dog curled together on the narrow twin bed, Ethan's arm draped over Charlie's flank, Charlie's nose tucked under Ethan's chin. They looked peaceful. They looked complete. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah let herself hope. The first week was unremarkable. Charlie settled into the household with surprising ease, learning the layout of the small house, memorizing Sarah's schedule, instinctively understanding which sounds made Ethan uncomfortable and positioning himself as a buffer between the boy and the world. He seemed to know when the garbage truck was coming 3 minutes before it arrived, guiding Ethan to his noise-canceling headphones with gentle nudges. He seemed to know when Ethan was about to have a meltdown before even Ethan knew, curling his body around the boy's legs and grounding him with warmth and pressure and presence. Sarah found herself watching them constantly, searching for signs that this was working, that something was changing, that the walls around Ethan's voice were finally beginning to crack. But Ethan still didn't speak. He communicated with Charlie the same way he communicated with her, through touch and gesture and the occasional pointed glance. And while their bond was obviously deep and real and transformative, the silence remained. Until the night of the thunderstorm. It came without warning, a late October squall that swept in from the mountains and unleashed fury on the quiet neighborhood with the kind of biblical intensity that made headlines. Lightning cracked the sky open like a wound. Thunder shook the foundation of the house until the windows rattled in their frames. Rain hammered against the roof with such force that it sounded like applause or the footsteps of giants. Ethan hated storms. Every storm for the past 4 years had ended the same way, with him wedged into the corner of his closet, hands clamped over his ears, body rocking in a rhythm that was half self-soothing and half desperate prayer for the noise to stop. Sarah had learned to sit beside him during these episodes, not speaking, just present, waiting for the chaos to pass. But this night was different. She heard the sound before she understood it. A voice, small and rusty and so unexpected that for a moment she thought she had imagined it, that her exhausted brain had conjured what it wanted to hear. She stood frozen in the hallway, one hand on Ethan's door, and listened. "It's okay, Charlie. It's okay." For words. For impossible words. Sarah pushed open the door with a hand that trembled so badly she could barely control it. The sight that greeted her would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life. Ethan sat on his bed, his pajamas rumpled, his hair wild, his face illuminated by the intermittent flashes of lightning that turned the room into a strobe of shadows and brightness. And he was speaking, not to her. He didn't seem to have noticed her presence at all, but to Charlie, who lay across his lap with his head in the boy's hands. "Charlie says it's just sky drums," Ethan murmured, his voice scratchy from disuse, but unmistakably real, unmistakably present. "Charlie says the clouds are arguing, but they'll stop soon." Charlie says the lightning is just angels taking pictures. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. Ethan, her voice cracked on his name. The boy looked up at her, and for the first time in 4 years, something clicked into place behind his eyes. Recognition. Connection. A bridge spanning the chasm that had separated them since that terrible Tuesday morning when everything fell apart. "Hi, Mama," he said. And then, with a serious expression that seemed too old for his 8 years, "Charlie told me it's time to talk now." Sarah spent the next 3 days existing in a state of wonderment so profound that it bordered on delirium. Ethan spoke. He spoke at breakfast. He spoke while getting dressed. He spoke during the car ride to and from school. Not constantly. There were still long stretches of quiet, still moments when he retreated into his inner world. But the seal had been broken. The words flowed, and with them came revelations that left Sarah alternately laughing and crying, and standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning wondering if she had somehow crossed into an alternate reality. Ethan explained things. He explained that he had been able to speak all along, but that the words felt too heavy to lift out of his throat. He explained that the world was too loud and too bright and too much, and that silence had been his only armor against the overwhelming assault of existence. He explained that when Charlie arrived, something changed. The dog's presence muted the edges of the world, made everything softer, more manageable. But it was the other explanation that made Sarah's heart race with wonder. "Charlie tells me things," Ethan said matter-of-factly over a bowl of cereal one morning. "He tells me about people. He tells me who's nice and who needs help." Sarah forced herself to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean, sweetie? How does Charlie tell you?" Ethan considered the question with the gravity of a philosopher pondering the nature of existence. "He talks inside my head. Not with words like we use. With feelings. Pictures. Sometimes smells. He showed me what the mailman smells like inside. Like sad and alone, and I felt bad for him. He showed me what the old lady at the grocery store smells like she misses someone very much. And Charlie says we should say hello to her next time." Sarah looked at Charlie, who sat beside Ethan's chair as always, those amber eyes watching her with their gentle intelligence. The dog's tail wagged once, a single acknowledgement, as if he knew exactly what was being said and exactly how remarkable it sounded. "And Charlie," Sarah ventured carefully, "has he told you anything else?" Ethan nodded slowly. A look of deep concentration crossed his face. "He told me about someone. Someone who got lost a long time ago. Someone who really misses their family and wishes they could come home." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Who, sweetheart?" "Charlie doesn't know her name exactly. He just knows she wandered away from home and couldn't find her way back. She's been living far away, and she doesn't remember where she came from. But Charlie says we can help her remember. Charlie says she's not really lost. She just forgot the way." That evening, Sarah found herself at the computer, searching through missing persons databases, news archives, anything that might connect to what Ethan had described. She didn't know what she was looking for, didn't know what she expected to find. But something in her son's words had struck a chord of truth that resonated deeper than logic. And then she found it. An article from 23 years ago. A young woman named Elena Marsh, 19 years old at the time, had disappeared from a mental health facility during a period of crisis. She had been suffering from severe amnesia following a traumatic car accident that had taken both her parents. The last sighting placed her hitchhiking on a highway 3 states away. The case had gone cold decades ago. But the photo made Sarah's heart stop. The woman in the image bore a striking resemblance to someone Sarah saw every week, the quiet, gray-haired woman who worked at the flower shop downtown. The one who always seemed slightly lost, slightly confused, as if she was perpetually trying to remember something just out of reach. The one who wore a name tag that said Jane, because, as the shop owner had once mentioned, she had shown up 15 years ago with no memory of who she was or where she came from. The next morning, Sarah drove to the flower shop with a hope she barely dared to acknowledge. The woman, Jane, was arranging roses near the window, her movements slow and careful, her eyes carrying that familiar, distant quality. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this might sound strange, but do you remember anything about your life before you came here?" Jane looked up, and something flickered across her weathered face. "Why do you ask?" "Because I think someone might be looking for you. I think you might have a family who never stopped hoping you'd come home." The investigation that followed would make local news for its heartwarming conclusion. DNA testing confirmed what the photographs had suggested. Jane was indeed Elena Marsh, now 42 years old, who had spent over 2 decades living under a different name with no memory of her true identity. Her extended family, cousins, and aunt who had never given up hope, were contacted. A reunion was arranged. And through it all, Charlie watched with those knowing amber eyes, his tail wagging gently whenever Ethan told him they had done a good thing. The day of Elena's reunion with her family was one Sarah would never forget. They gathered in the community center. Elena, her elderly Aunt Margaret who had searched for her for 23 years, cousins who had grown up hearing stories about the family member who vanished. Television cameras were there, reporters asking questions about the miracle of reunion. But Elena kept looking past them, her eyes searching for something specific. When she finally spotted Ethan and Charlie standing near the back of the crowd, she walked toward them with tears streaming down her face. "They told me," she said, kneeling to be at Ethan's level, "that a little boy and his dog helped find me, that you somehow knew I was lost even when I didn't know it myself." Ethan nodded seriously. "Charlie knew. Charlie told me you forgot who you were, but you didn't forget how to be kind. He said that's how he recognized you, by the kindness that was still there even when everything else was gone." Elena reached out and cupped Ethan's face in her weathered hands. "I don't understand how," she whispered. "I don't think I ever will. But thank you. Thank you for giving me back something I didn't even know I had lost." Then she turned to Charlie, and the dog pressed his head against her palm with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. "And thank you," she said to him, "for seeing what no one else could see. Before you scroll away, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country name in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell because we bring you stories like this every single week. Stories about connections that transcend understanding. Stories about love that speaks louder than words. Stories about heroes who walk on 4 legs and have absolutely no idea how extraordinary they are. Now, back to the story, because there's more you need to know. The news coverage brought attention that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Reporters wanted to interview the miracle dog and the silent boy who spoke. Child psychologists wanted to study Ethan's breakthrough. Animal behaviorists wanted to examine Charlie's seemingly supernatural perception. Everyone wanted a piece of their story. Sarah refused most of it. She had watched her son become a headline once before. The poor autistic boy abandoned by his father, the silent child who retreated from the world, and she had no intention of letting it happen again. What occurred between Ethan and Charlie was theirs. The rest of the world could wonder, could speculate, could believe or dismiss as they chose. But the truth would remain where it belonged, in the quiet moments between a boy and his dog, in the language that existed beyond words, in the understanding that some things are sacred precisely because they cannot be explained. But one request she couldn't refuse. Margaret Marsh, Elena's aunt, the woman who had spent 23 years never giving up hope, asked to meet them properly. Not for cameras, not for interviews, just to say thank you in a way that felt personal and real. They met at a small cafe on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week that David Mitchell had left all those years ago. Sarah noticed the coincidence and wondered if the universe was trying to tell her something about endings and beginnings, about doors that close and doors that open. Margaret was in her 70s, small and silver-haired, with eyes that held both grief and joy in equal measure. She sat across from Ethan with Charlie settled at the boy's feet, and she spoke in a voice that trembled with emotion. 23 years, she said. I looked for her for 23 years. I hired private investigators. I posted flyers. I called hospitals and shelters and police stations in every state. Everyone told me to give up. Everyone said she was gone. But I couldn't. Something in my heart kept telling me she was out there somewhere, living a life she couldn't remember, waiting to be found. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Elena as a young woman, smiling, holding a puppy with mismatched ears. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes widening. That dog looks like Charlie. Margaret smiled through her tears. This was Elena's dog. His name was Charles. He died of old age about 10 years after Elena disappeared. I always wondered if somehow, some way, he was still looking for her too. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Charlie, the rescue dog found wandering on the highway with no history, no collar, no chip. Charlie, who had known, somehow, that a woman named Elena was lost and needed to be found. Charlie, whose amber eyes held depths that seemed impossible for any ordinary animal. It couldn't be the same dog. The timeline made no sense. Dogs didn't live that long. Dogs didn't reincarnate. Dogs didn't carry memories across lifetimes to finish missions left incomplete. And yet Charlie lay at Ethan's feet, his gaze fixed on the photograph with an intensity that defied explanation. And when Margaret held the picture closer, the dog let out a soft whine, the first truly distressed sound Sarah had ever heard him make, and pressed his nose against the faded image of a puppy who had been dead for more than a decade. Some things, Margaret said softly, watching the dog with wonder, aren't meant to be explained. Some things are meant to be accepted. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to speak. His vocabulary expanded. His sentences grew longer and more complex. Therapists who had once written pages of concerned notes now documented progress that they privately described as unprecedented. But he still talked to Charlie, still reported on the dog's observations and insights with the casual certainty of someone describing the weather. Charlie says the crossing guard is worried about her husband because he forgets things now, Ethan announced one afternoon. Charlie says there's a kitten stuck behind the shed in the Petersons' yard, and someone should help it. They checked. There was. Charlie says you're tired today, Mama, and that you should rest more because you work hard and you deserve good things. Sarah had stopped questioning it, stopped trying to understand, because understanding wasn't the point. The point was that her son was here, present, connected to the world in a way she had never imagined possible. The point was that somewhere in this house, a scraggly rescue mutt with one floppy ear had performed miracles that no scientific study could ever quantify. Did Charlie actually communicate telepathically with Ethan? Did the dog somehow possess abilities that transcended normal canine perception? Or had Ethan's brilliant, unique brain simply used Charlie as a bridge, a safe interface through which he could finally express the observations and intuitions that had always been there, locked away behind walls of fear and overstimulation? Sarah didn't know. Sarah didn't care. What she knew was this: Elena Marsh, now reconnected with a family she didn't remember losing, had been found because of a bond that shouldn't exist but did. What she knew was this: her son, who had been lost in silence for 4 years, had found his voice because a dog walked into his life and told him it was time to speak. What she knew was this: the world was larger and stranger and more wondrous than anyone wanted to admit, and somewhere in the spaces between the mundane and the miraculous, impossible things happened every day to people who were ready to receive them. Charlie passed away 3 years later, peacefully, in his sleep, curled on the bed where he and Ethan had spent countless nights in wordless communion. He was 7 years old. Nobody knew exactly, since his history before the rescue remained a mystery, and he left behind a legacy that defied measurement. The day after Charlie died, Ethan sat Sarah down at the kitchen table with an expression that she had come to recognize, the look he wore when Charlie had told him something important. But Charlie was gone now. The dog wasn't there to serve as translator between Ethan's inner world and the outer one she inhabited. "Mama," Ethan said, "I need to tell you something that Charlie made me promise to tell you after he left." Sarah braced herself. After everything, after the speaking, after Elena, after 3 years of marveling at her son's transformation, she thought she was prepared for anything. Charlie wasn't just looking for Elena. Ethan began, his voice steady but his eyes distant, as if he was reciting something he had memorized long ago. He was looking for lots of people. Lost people. Forgotten people. People who slipped through the cracks and needed someone to notice them. Sarah leaned forward, her heart aching with a mix of grief and wonder. "He found me first because I was lost too. Not the same way Elena was lost. I knew where I lived and I knew my name. But I was lost inside. Lost in the quiet. And he helped me find my way out so I could help him find the others." Ethan's eyes glistened with tears he was trying hard not to shed. He said I was his translator, like he was speaking a language that only certain people could hear, and I was one of them. He said there are more people out there who need finding, and he hopes I'll keep looking even though he can't help anymore. Sarah reached across the table and took her son's hands in hers. Is that what you want to do? Keep helping lost people. Ethan nodded solemnly. Charlie said the world is full of people who got forgotten. Old people in nursing homes whose families stopped visiting. Homeless people who had names and stories before they ended up on the streets. Immigrants who lost their papers and can't prove who they are. He said every single person deserves to be found. Every single person deserves to be remembered. They sat there for a long time, neither speaking, while somewhere in the silence between them, the echo of amber eyes seemed to watch and approve. Elena Marsh visited them often after the reunion. She was slowly rebuilding her memory, piece by piece. Childhood birthday parties, her parents' faces, the smell of her grandmother's kitchen. Sometimes she would cry with joy at what she remembered. Sometimes she would cry with grief for all the years she had lost. But she was whole again, connected to a history that had been waiting patiently for her to return. On her last visit before moving back to her hometown to be closer to her Aunt Margaret, Elena sat with Ethan on the back porch, watching Charlie's grave marker, a simple stone that read, "Charlie. He found the lost." "Do you still hear him?" Elena asked softly. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Not the way I used to. Not like he's talking to me. But sometimes, when I'm very still and very quiet, I feel something. Like a memory of a feeling. Like warmth that doesn't come from the sun." Elena nodded. "I feel it too. I think maybe he's not really gone. Not completely. I think maybe he just moved somewhere we can't see, and he's still out there, still looking for people who need to be found." "Do you think he'll come back?" Ethan asked. Elena smiled, a smile touched by sadness and hope in equal measure. "I think he never really left. I think creatures like that, whatever he was, don't follow the same rules as the rest of us. Maybe he's already back, already in some other dog at some other shelter, waiting for the next person who can hear him." Ethan considered this. Charlie used to say that love doesn't end. It just changes shape. "That sounds like him," Elena said. "That sounds exactly like him." Ethan graduated high school with honors. He enrolled in social work school, determined to dedicate his life to helping the forgotten and overlooked members of society. He never lost the sensitivity that Charlie had unlocked, the ability to sense when someone was struggling, when someone needed kindness, when someone had been invisible for too long. He founded a nonprofit organization called Finding the Lost, which specialized in reconnecting homeless individuals with estranged families, helping amnesia patients piece together their identities, and advocating for vulnerable populations who had fallen through society's cracks. The organization grew from a small volunteer operation run out of his apartment to a national network with chapters in every state. At every office, in every location, there was a framed photograph near the entrance. A scruffy dog with one ear up and one ear flopped, amber eyes gazing out at visitors with an expression that somehow managed to convey both profound wisdom and unconditional love. "Who's that?" new volunteers would inevitably ask. "That's Charlie," Ethan would respond, a small smile playing at his lips. "He's the one who started all of this." And then, depending on how much time he had and how receptive the listener seemed, he might tell them the story. About a boy who couldn't speak and a dog who could. About a woman lost for 23 years and the impossible chain of events that brought her home. About miracles that walk among us disguised as ordinary things, and love that speaks in languages we're only beginning to understand. Years later, when his daughter was born, a quiet, watchful baby with her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, Ethan would tell her stories about Charlie. About the dog who spoke in feelings. About the people who were found. About the way love, sometimes, finds channels that logic cannot explain and science cannot measure. The daughter would grow up believing that the world was stranger and more wonderful than most people knew, that heroes came in all shapes and sizes, that silence was not absence but possibility, and that the right creature at the right moment could change absolutely everything. She would also grow up knowing, without being told, that she was named for that creature. Her name was Charlotte. Charlie, for short. And sometimes, in the soft hush of twilight, when she sat very still and very quiet, she could almost feel something. A warmth that didn't come from the sun. A presence that watched over her with patience and love and gentle understanding. It felt like protection. It felt like purpose. It felt like someone, somewhere, was still keeping watch, still looking for the lost, still waiting for the next person who needed to be found. The world is full of voices. We speak to each other across distances vast and small, through words and gestures and expressions and the million tiny signals that constitute human connection. But beneath all of that, beneath language and logic and the tidy boxes we use to organize reality, there exists another layer, a deeper frequency, a place where the barriers between minds become permeable, where the limitations of species become meaningless, where love speaks in its purest form. Charlie lived in that place, and for a brief, shining moment, he brought Ethan there too. Some will say it was coincidence. Some will say it was the peculiar wiring of an autistic brain creating patterns from chaos. Some will say that dogs are simply more perceptive than we give them credit for, that they read body language and pheromones and 1,000 other signals that humans miss, and that Ethan was simply translating those signals into a narrative his mind could understand. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps there are explanations waiting to be discovered that will wrap this whole story in the comforting blanket of science and probability. Perhaps everything miraculous, given enough time and study, becomes mundane. But Sarah Mitchell, sitting on her porch in the golden light of an October sunset, watching her grandchildren play in a yard that still held the memory of a scruffy mutt with mismatched ears, knew better. Some things, she understood, were not meant to be explained. Some things were meant to be believed. If you made it this far, you're part of a special group. You're someone who understands that the world isn't always what it appears to be, that miracles walk among us wearing ordinary disguises, that the bond between a human and an animal can transcend every barrier we think exists. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who has given up on impossible things, someone who has a child or a parent or a friend locked in a silence that feels eternal. Tell them that walls come down. Tell them that voices return. Tell them that somewhere out there, in a shelter or a pound or a roadside ditch, a creature is waiting. A creature with something to say. A creature who, given the chance, might just change a life. Not because dogs are magical, but because love is. And sometimes, when we least expect it, love finds a way to speak in languages we never knew existed, whispering secrets that no one else can hear, telling truths that no one else can understand, bridging gaps that no one else believed could be crossed. Charlie was just a dog, a rescue mutt with no history and no pedigree and nothing special about him except the warmth in his chest and the loyalty in his heart. But he changed the world anyway. He reunited a family. He unlocked a boy. He reminded a mother that hope is never wasted, that miracles are never impossible, that the universe is vast and mysterious and kind in ways that we cannot see until we're ready to see them. He was just a dog, but he was also so much more. And somewhere, in whatever place good dogs go when their work is done, Charlie is running through endless fields, his ears flopping, his tail wagging, his amber eyes bright with the joy of a soul who fulfilled his purpose, and then some. He is waiting, patiently, knowing, as he always knew, that love never really ends. It just finds new ways to speak.